Susan Jane Berman was born in Minneapolis, Minnesota, USA, on May 18, 1945, to David Berman and Betty Ewald. David Berman, Susan's father, was a significant figure in the Jewish American gang scene on the Las Vegas Strip and managed the renowned Flamingo Hotel during the early days of Vegas's development. He was often known as Dave the Jew and provided Susan with everything she needed. Well, almost everything. Growing up on the Vegas Strip, Susan didn't return home from school every day to do her homework. Instead, she practiced math by counting chips at the casino. While this unconventional routine suggested a perfect life, tragedy struck when Susan was just 12. David Berman reportedly passed away from a heart attack during a routine surgery to remove colon polyps. The mysterious and controversial circumstances of her father's death would have profound and lasting effects on young Susan's life. This double tragedy meant Susan had to leave Vegas. Susan's uncle Charles Chicky Berman took her to live with him and his family in Lewiston, Idaho. It was at a junior high school in Lewiston that an English and a history teacher discovered Susan's unmistakable talent for writing and inspired her to pursue a career in writing. Susan subsequently enrolled at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, to study sociology. During her final year, she met a graduate student who would become her best friend for life, Robert Allen Durst. Robert, or Bobby Durst as was his nickname, was at UCLA for a one-year master's program. Both students came from privileged backgrounds, and it seemed like they clicked almost instantly. Beyond a privileged background, Susan shared something else in common with her newfound friend. Both Susan and Robert had lost both their mothers at a young age. In 1969, Susan eventually went on to get a master's degree in journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. Susan was a part of a selection of 30 students for the graduate program in journalism at UC Berkeley. According to Elizabeth Moran, one of her classmates who became a national correspondent at the LA Times, Susan was simply exceptional. Of the select 30, none was short of talent and wits, but the aura of Susan made her stand out. She could engage any kind of audience and keep them hooked. Susan had all the ingredients to become a successful journalist, at least according to her classmates. That would prove to be true. Just 2 years after her graduation, she landed a job at the popular newspaper, San Francisco Examiner. She also wrote the famous 1971 college guidebook, The Underground Guide to the College of Your Choice. In the early 80s, Susan moved to New York, where she wrote for the New York Magazine, Cosmopolitan, and Family Circle. In New York, Susan met James Brady, an investigative reporter. James and Susan became friends as she began working on writing a memoir about her late father. Susan requested the criminal records and investigative reports about her father from the FBI and the Department of Justice. She was left stunned to see her father, David, had been linked to gangland violence, mob crimes, and several murders, many of which she and her mother were completely oblivious about. Her 1981 book, Easy Street, The True Story of a Mob Family, eventually became one of her most significant works, where she detailed her life as the daughter of a mobster. The book was such a success that Hollywood producers became interested in adapting the book into a movie. The movie rights were sold for $350,000. The book party was held at Sammy's Romanian Steakhouse on Manhattan's Lower East Side. The book party was hosted by Susan's ever-present best friend, Robert Durst. Susan would later get married to her heartthrob Christopher Margulies at the Hotel Bel Air in LA. Again, her ever-present best friend Robert Durst walked her down the aisle. In 1986, just 2 years after their marriage, Susan would lose the love of her life. Christopher Margulies died of a heroin overdose. By the mid-90s, Susan moved to West Hollywood. The 50-year-old writer was at the peak of her powers and had just been nominated for a Writers Guild of America award. In the late 90s, Susan moved to a rented apartment in Benedict Canyon, one of the main thoroughfares from West Hollywood to the Valley area. It was just 2 miles away from Rodeo Drive, one of the most expensive streets on the planet. Susan was one of the top journalists in the area. She had just began working on a project titled Sin City for Showtime TV. The project was reportedly Showtime's response to HBO's well-acclaimed TV series, The Sopranos. For Susan, this was the ideal neighborhood. No one knew Susan's biggest project yet would never hit the screens. After Susan moved to Benedict Canyon, she focused more on her upcoming work for Showtime. On December 19, 2000, a few days before Christmas, Susan Berman got on a call with her actress friend, Kim Langford. It was the first time in several years that Susan and Kim were not spending the holidays together. That call was quite unusual and Susan seemed worried. The conversation that ensued scared Kim. Susan seemed to have some information that could change a lot of things. Kim was curious to know what this information was, but Susan didn't have it herself. But Susan assured Kim she knew where to get this information. Although Kim feared for her friend's life, Susan was a well-renowned journalist. So Kim presumed this big information was about one of her upcoming big projects. No one knew what exactly this big information was. At 1 p.m. on Christmas Eve 2000, LA police received a call to Susan's home on 15/27 Benedict Canyon Road. Her neighbors had become worried when one of her dogs was seen barking and running around loose. This came as a surprise since Susan loved her fox terriers and would never leave them unattended. Police arrived at the scene to find Susan's body murdered in cold blood, execution style with a 9mm handgun. She was shot to the back of the head with a single bullet, and it was estimated that she had been dead for at least 1 day. Kim's fears were confirmed. Susan was dead. Trailing Susan's killer was not going to be easy. Her killer had at least a 1-day head start since the body was found a day late. Police found Susan's body lying on the guest room floor, dressed in sweats and a t-shirt with only one shell casing lying next to her body. The front door was unlocked, and a rear door was found ajar. Nothing was stolen. Police knew they were dealing with someone who had known the victim as there was no sign of a forced entry, and there were no defensive wounds found on Susan's body. The motive for her gruesome murder remained unclear. The media began to drive the narrative that the murder was gang-related since Susan's father David had been a gangster and she had been killed execution style. But the police noted that most of her father's associates and rivals were already dead, while Susan wrote a memoir about her father ruling out the possibility of a gang-related murder. The first major lead in the case came sooner than investigators expected. Just 2 days after Susan's death, this major lead, though, was shrouded in mystery. The Beverly Hills Police Department received a mysterious anonymous letter mailed to their office. The letter only contained Susan's address, 1527 Benedict Canyon, in a green pen on a white piece of paper with the word cadaver. Clearly, someone didn't want Susan's body lying on the floor for long. Police observed that there was a typographical error made by the writer of the letter with the incorrect spelling of Beverly as Beverly. Although this seemed insignificant at first, little did they know that this minute detail would rather prove to be a crucial piece of evidence aiding the investigators in the relentless pursuit to apprehend the perpetrator. Even though the police found Susan's body only a day after her death, her killer would not be found so soon. It would take 14 long years, a rather painful wait for the friends and family of Susan Berman. To end this wait, they had to find out who wrote this mystery note. Was it the killer or was it a witness? Investigators had to piece together a complex puzzle to catch the culprit. Susan was reportedly going to be questioned by the LAPD at the time of her death in connection with the disappearance of Catherine Durst, her best friend's wife who had gone missing without a trace. Like in many cases of disappearance of a spouse, her partner was considered the prime suspect. Upon further investigation, Robert Durst could not be eliminated as a suspect in the disappearance of his wife, Catherine, and neither could he be charged. All the evidence linking him to her disappearance was merely circumstantial. Since Susan was scheduled to be interviewed by police about what she knew of Robert Durst's possible involvement in the disappearance of his wife, police suspected Robert may have been involved in killing Susan to silence her, but there was no concrete evidence. After 15 years of this very twisted cold case, no one, not even investigators, could have imagined where the first big break would have come from. In the years following Susan Berman's death, Robert, the prime suspect in both cases, was villainized by the press. In an effort to exonerate himself from both unsolved cases, he worked with filmmaker Andrew Jarecki on the documentary The Jinx, The Life and Death of Robert Durst. The documentary featured 3 of Robert's most prominent alleged criminal activities: the 1982 disappearance of his wife, Catherine Durst, the 2000 point-blank execution of his best friend, Susan Berman, and the 2001 death and dismemberment of Robert's neighbor, Morris Black. Robert had claimed self-defense in the murder of Morris Black and was acquitted at the trial. The uncanny and wriggly Robert Allen Durst was born in New York on April 12, 1943 to Seymour Durst and Bernice Herstein. Robert Durst was the first son of a real estate mogul and the heir to the Durst family empire. When Robert was just 7, he claimed to have witnessed his mother, Bernice, jumping off the edge of the roof of their family home. Most investigators say her death was an accident, and the family acknowledged that Bernice took her own life. In a March 2015 interview with the New York Times, Robert's brother Douglas Durst claimed no one witnessed the event. Why Robert claims to have witnessed his mother's death remains unclear. This conflicting report was just one of many blows and counter-blows of a fearsome sibling rivalry like no other. At age 10, Robert visited his psychiatrist to counsel him on this newfound sibling rivalry. The psychiatrist reported that Robert had personality decomposition and schizophrenia. He attended the Scarsdale High School, where his classmates described him as a loner. He obtained his bachelor's degree in economics from Lehigh University in 1965. Later that year, he met Susan Berman at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, where he enrolled in a doctoral program, but eventually withdrew from the school and returned to New York in 1969. At this time, Robert had no interest in his father's company, Durst Organization. He preferred to start something of his own. So between 1970 and 1971, he opened a small health food store in Vermont. In 1970, Robert met Catherine McCormick, a dental hygienist, and in January 1972, the pair began living together in Vermont. In 1973, on the advice of Robert's father, they returned to New York so Robert could work with the Durst Organization. And on April 12, 1973, on Robert's 30th birthday, he officially got married to Catherine. Although to many friends of the couple, they appeared to have a fairy tale life. A closer look at their lives in the weeks leading to Catherine's disappearance shows there was more to it than meets the eye. A few weeks before her death, many signs pointed to foul play. Catherine had been treated for facial bruises inflicted on her by Robert just 3 weeks before her disappearance at Jacob Medical Center in the Bronx. She never pressed charges. A few weeks before her mysterious disappearance, she had asked Robert for a $250,000 divorce settlement. Robert was not interested in parting with so much money and instead offered $100,000 to Catherine. Before Catherine could review the offer, Robert had grown impatient. He canceled his wife's credit card, removed her name from their joint account, and stopped paying her tuition fees at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. He also reduced his divorce payout offer to $15,000. On January 31, 1982, a few months before she earned her degree in pediatrics from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine in New York City, Catherine Durst simply disappeared into thin air. Catherine was last seen at a dinner party organized by her friend Gilbert Nozami in Newtown, Connecticut on the eve of January 31st. Catherine and Robert were known to have fought that evening. Catherine's cottage was found ransacked shortly after she was declared missing and 3 weeks after her disappearance. Police found her possessions in the building's garbage compactor. Catherine was declared legally dead in 2017, but her disappearance in the exact circumstances remain a mystery even to this day. Once before Susan was killed, the NYPD had been asked to reopen the investigation into the disappearance of Catherine at the request of Westchester County District Attorney Janine Pirro. The investigation was publicized and friends urged investigators to contact Susan Berman for an interview since she was close to Robert. Susan Berman had managed Robert Durst interviews with the media after the disappearance of his wife. She reportedly knew much about the disappearance. While his wife's disappearance remained a mystery and his involvement in Susan's death a mere suspicion, Robert's next act was more clear-cut. On October 9, 2001, he was arrested in connection with the death of his elderly neighbor Morris Black. Morris's body parts were found dismembered floating in Galveston Bay in Texas. After being released on bail amounting to $250,000, he failed to appear for a court hearing scheduled on October 16th, resulting in a warrant being issued for his arrest due to bail jumping. Then on November 30th, Durst was apprehended at a Wegmans supermarket in Bethlehem. Pennsylvania, where he had attempted to shoplift Band-Aids, a newspaper, and a chicken salad sandwich. Some suspicious items were found in his rental car when he was apprehended. $37,000 in cash, 2 guns, marijuana, Black's driver's license, and directions to Gilbert Najami's home in Connecticut. While evading authorities, Durst disturbingly used his time to stalk his own brother, Douglas, even going so far to visit the driveway of his residence in Cadona, New York, while armed. He was eventually extradited to Texas for trial. In 2003, Robert Durst stood trial for the murder of Morris Black. His defense attorney Dick DeJurin argued Robert had acted in self-defense and the weapons discharged as they both struggled when Morris threatened him with a .22 caliber pistol. Robert admitted to having dismembered Morris's body with a knife, saw, and axe before dumping his remains in Galveston Bay. Since Morris's head was never found, Robert's claim of a struggle and location of the gunshot wound could not be confirmed or dismissed. On November 11, 2003, the jury acquitted Robert Durst for lack of forensics to prove capital murder. He, however, received a 5-year sentence for tampering with evidence and jumping bail. He was paroled in July 2005. The terms of Robert Durst's parole required him to stay near his home and seek authorization before making any trip. Robert Durst made an unauthorized trip back to the crime scene where he had killed Morris Black. On his Defiant Crime tour, he ran into an unexpected but familiar face. Galveston County District Court Judge Susan Criss, who had presided over his murder trial. They were both shocked to see each other. With this unauthorized trip, Robert Durst violated his parole terms and was returned to prison. He was then released in March 2006. Robert was naturally the heir of the Durst organization, but in 1992, his father decided to pick his younger brother Douglas Durst to take over the Durst organization, another stern choice in the already heated sibling rivalry. His father said that his choice of Douglas was due to Robert's inappropriate conduct, but Robert was having none of that. He believed he was the rightful heir to the Durst organization, and after returning from prison, he decided to sue his family. The lengthy lawsuit finally ended in 2006, and Robert Durst was bought out for a one-time payment of $65 million. This lawsuit brought a more tumultuous twist to the relationship between Durst and his family. The Jinx was supposed to clear the air, but it turned out to be an actual jinx for Robert. During the filming of The Jinx, Susan Berman's stepson, Sareb Kaufman, uncovered a letter Robert had written to Susan in 1999, a few months before her death. The typographical error was the same in both Robert's letter and the anonymous letter sent to the police. The handwriting was almost indistinguishable. When the director of The Jinx, Uretsky, saw the letter, he showed Robert Durst the spelling of the word Beverly from both letters and asked which one Robert didn't write. But the enigmatic millionaire could tell and was rather left stunned. On March 14, 2015, a day before the airing of the final episode of the HBO series, The Jinx, Robert Durst was arrested by the FBI in New Orleans and charged with the first-degree murder of his best friend, Susan Berman. Robert made a few checks to his voicemail box, enabling investigators to trace his location. He remained stunned. Investigators were able to trace him to the Canal Street Marriott, having checked in with the false name, Everett Ward. A fake Texas ID was also found, a .38 caliber loaded revolver, a new phone, a flesh-tone latex mask, maps of Louisiana, Florida, and Cuba, and over $200,000 in cash were found with Robert. According to bank transactions, he had withdrawn over $315,000 in the last 5 to 6 weeks. Investigators speculate he was planning to flee to Cuba since they have no extradition treaty with the U.S. After a lifetime of circumventing the law, Robert Durst would finally come face to face with justice. Robert Durst initially received an 85-month sentence for his firearm charges while he awaited trial in the Susan Berman case. The trial was delayed due to Robert undergoing surgery and the prosecutors seeking more evidence to finally put the elusive killer behind bars. In October 2018, Judge Mark Windham of the Los Angeles County Superior Court finally decided there was enough evidence to charge Robert Durst with the murder of his best friend, Susan Berman. On March 2, 2020, after much delay, Robert Durst finally appeared in court to begin his trial. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, The trial was postponed to May 17, 2021. During the trial, Robert's defense team asked for a mistrial and a halt to the trial at least 3 times due to Robert's ailing medical condition. But the jury decided to proceed with the trial each time. Robert Durst was found guilty of the first-degree murder of Susan Berman. On October 14, 2021, he was finally sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was incarcerated at the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. On November 1, 2021, after almost 40 long years, a New York grand jury finally indicted Robert Durst for the murder of his wife, but he would never stand trial. On January 10, 2022, Robert died of cardiac arrest just 3 months after his sentencing, aged 78. After Robert's sentence was read, one of Susan Berman's cousins, David Berman, said he visited Susan Berman's grave and told her she could rest easy, that justice has been done. Ellen Strauss, a friend of Catherine Durst, was happy that Susan's family would finally get justice, but then hoped that Catherine would get justice too before Robert died. According to California law, Robert Durst's death renders moot the murder charge filed against him for the death of his wife. Douglas Durst said this of his brother Robert's death: "Bob lived a sad, painful, and tragic life. We hope that his death brings some closure to those he hurt." Robert Durst used complex schemes to evade justice for his heinous crimes. His final act in this deceitful plan exposed how he betrayed both his wife and his friend Susan Berman. Could Susan Berman have known about Catherine Durst's disappearance? Was her death a result of Durst's fear that she might disclose what she knew to the authorities? As one FBI agent noted, "God allows criminals to make mistakes, but it's up to us to find them." Do you think the Jinx was that crucial mistake? Share your thoughts in the comments. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. On December 14, 2005, Yasser Macias and his wife, Rosalia Lopez Martinez, celebrated the birth of their first child, a son named Salvador, at the Mexican Social Security Institute 45 clinic in Guadalajara. Unfortunately, their joy was short-lived. A woman, whom the couple thought was a nurse, entered their hospital room and inquired if the newborn had been fed. Later, she returned to guide Yasser out of the building, stating that visiting hours had ended. She then reappeared to Rosalia, saying she needed to take the baby to another room to feed him. She never returned with the newborn. Instead, the woman, who was not a nurse, left the hospital, taking baby Salvador with her. The official search for Salvador went on for months without success. His parents never gave up on finding their son, even as years passed without progress. Officials eventually told the couple that the case was no longer being investigated, but this did not weaken their resolve. They went on to have 2 more children and were determined that they would one day meet their older brother. Salvador's case received renewed public interest in August of 2021 when another newborn was kidnapped from a hospital close to the one where Salvador was born under similar circumstances. Unlike Salvador's case, this case was quickly resolved when the abducted baby was found abandoned in the stairway of a nearby apartment building. The woman who kidnapped the baby, however, remained unidentified. The renewed interest in cases of infant abductions from hospitals led to the Jalisco Institute of Forensic Sciences generating an image of what Salvador Macias may have looked like as a teenager. This image was released to the public and resulted in the tip that finally led to Salvador's disappearance being solved. A tipster called in, reporting that a teenager who resembled the image was living in El Salto with a couple claiming to be his parents. They were able to provide important information about the teenager as well as pictures. Investigators spent months following up on this lead, and DNA tests ultimately confirmed that this young man was Rosalia and Yasser's biological son. On February 17, 2022, the couple was reunited with their now 16-year-old son. Neighbors described the young man, now known to be Salvador Macias, as a polite and kind teenager who had lots of friends and never said anything rude. The man and woman they believed to be his parents were also polite and considerate. They never suspected that there was anything unusual about the family. The couple, Salvador, grew up believing to be his parents, reportedly left home, leaving Salvador alone. The day before, authorities came to bring him back to his biological parents. There was a sighting of the woman acting as his mother at a neighborhood grocery store with several suitcases. This woman is yet to be located and questioned by authorities. Salvador Bernal, the man who she lived with, has come forward and been questioned. He claims to have not known that the baby he had believed to be his own had been kidnapped. He says his partner did not allow him to be an active part of her pregnancy or allow him to attend any ultrasound appointments. However, he did not question that she had given birth to his son when she returned home with a baby in December of 2005. So far, the woman remains at large and no criminal charges have been filed. Salvador's parents have stated that they cannot describe in words how happy they are to have finally found their son. In 2021, 37-year-old Li Jingwei was a father of 2 living in the Hunan province of China. This was not the location of his birth, however. Jingwei could not remember the name of the village where he had been born, the names of his parents, or his own birth name because he had been the victim of child trafficking. When Jingwei was just 4 years old, one of his neighbors lured him away from his home with the promise of taking him to see some cars. While Jingwei did not remember the name of the village, he did remember that it was very remote, and cars were not a common sight, so he went with the neighbor. The neighbor took the little boy to a road behind a hill where 4 other men were waiting with bicycles. Jingwei burst into tears. He was placed on one of the bikes and taken away from the village. He begged to go home, but his abductors refused to take him back. Within a few hours, the little boy realized that these were bad men and he would not be able to make it back home. Jingwei remembers being given new clothes and taken onto a train by a couple in their 40s. They rode the train for a full day and night. He was eventually sold to a family in the Hunan province who raised him as their son and treated him well. Jingwei did not remember the name of his village, but he remembered what it looked like. Over the following several years, whenever he felt homesick or sad, he would obsessively draw maps of the village. Before he was old enough to attend school, he would etch the map into the dirt with sticks, and when he was older, he would draw the map on pages of his notebooks at school. He spent years drawing the map every single day. It would be this map that would help reunite him with his biological family after more than 3 decades. Of kidnappings that occur in the country each year. The U.S. State Department estimates that approximately 20,000 children are abducted in China every year, with independent estimates being much higher. Abductions of boys are common for domestic adoption, a practice believed to be the result of the high value traditionally placed on having a son in China now that social media and DNA technology are more accessible. In recent years, there have been several high-profile cases of parents being reunited with their abducted children after decades of separation. It was seeing reports of these reunions that inspired Li Jingwei to search for his own family. He was further spurred into action by the realization that his mother and father would be getting older and could pass away before he found them. Since he could not remember details like his birth name or the name of his village, he could not simply return to the place of his birth and look for his family. After speaking with his adoptive family, he submitted his DNA to a database in hopes of finding his biological family. While it did not immediately identify his family specifically, it did give him a general idea of where he was most likely born. To help identify the exact village where he was from, volunteers Jingwei had been consulting with suggested that he make a post on social media featuring the map he had drawn thousands of times as a child and could still draw from memory. He did make such a video featuring the map and his story and shared it on the Chinese social media platform Douyin. The video was viewed tens of thousands of times within days of it being posted, and Jingwei received additional help from the Ministry of Public Security. The village in Jingwei's map was identified as one near Gaodong in the province of Yunnan, 1,000 miles away from where he lived with his adoptive family. There was a woman there looking for her missing son, who would be the same age as Jingwei and had gone missing around the time he believed his abduction occurred. Jingwei first spoke to this woman over the phone, and she asked him if he had a scar on his chin, which he did. A DNA test soon confirmed that this woman was, in fact, Jingwei's mother. They then spoke over a video chat, and Jingwei was shocked to see that they shared so many physical features, like their mouth and their teeth. He remembered his father's face well enough to know that they had similar foreheads and eyes. On January 1st, 2022, Jingwei was finally reunited with his family at a police station in Hunan. Overcome with emotion, he collapsed at his mother's feet when he first saw her and needed help from his brother and sister to stand and hug her. Both he and his mother were in tears, and she cried out, "I finally found my baby." Jingwei's father passed away before he was able to find his son. Jingwei planned to spend the upcoming Lunar New Year holiday, bringing his own children to visit his father's grave in Yunnan and be reunited with his extended family. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. Janice Bullock was the mother of 4 children. After she and her husband divorced, the children remained with him, although court hearings involving the custody of the children were ongoing. Janice's children last saw her in 1974 and last heard from her in 1976 when she sent them a letter. In 1977, Janice was served with a subpoena, ordering her to appear in court for a custody hearing in Harrison County, Mississippi. When she was served with a subpoena, she was in Pearl River County, Mississippi. Authorities know she received the subpoena because she signed for it when she was served. However, Janice failed to show up for the court date, and her ex-husband was given full custody of their children. Later investigation would find that Janice had remained in Pearl River County for a time and worked as a waitress at Dickey's truck stop located on Highway 26 in Poplar after 1978. However, there was no record of her there. In a potentially concerning coincidence, around the time Janice was working at the truck stop, its owner killed his girlfriend and then himself. Janice's children began looking for her when they became adults, with their search efforts escalating in 2011. They submitted samples of their DNA and filed a report with the National Missing Persons Program. The program contacted the Harrison County Sheriff's Office in 2017, and they began their own investigation into Janice's disappearance. Once they were able to confirm that she had signed for the 1977 subpoena in Pearl River County, which was the last time they had any official record of her, they turned the case over to the Pearl River County Sheriff's Department in 2019. They subsequently determined that the last sighting of her was in 1978 when she was working at the truck stop. Her name and other identifying information had not been used since this time. Investigators followed up with known associates of Janice's, but none of them were able to provide solid leads. Then in December of 2021, a woman who had seen Janice's missing persons poster called in a tip that Janice had been working as a waitress in Raceland, Louisiana in the late 1970s or early 1980s. Authorities tracked down other individuals who had worked at the same diner around the same time, and while they remembered a woman who could have been Janice working there, they had not kept in contact with her and knew nothing of her current whereabouts. Mississippi Coast Crime Stoppers then shared a post about the case, which prompted another tip to come in. The individual who came forward knew a man, who was by then deceased, whose wife looked like Janice. She had been living under a different name, however. The couple's son was a man named David Streety, who was living in Goldways, Texas. An examination of his Facebook profile found photographs of a woman who bore a strong physical resemblance to Janice. In February of 2022, investigators traveled to Texas to meet with David, who told them that his mother was receiving care at a Fort Worth nursing home. The investigators then went to Fort Worth to meet with David's mother and confirmed that she was Janice Bullock. She had been living under her current alias since 1980. As if learning his mother was not who he believed her to be was not enough to process. Janice's son David also learned at this time that he was not his parents' biological child, as he had previously believed. Janice and the husband she had, while living under an assumed name, allegedly purchased David from his biological family for $1,000 when he was an infant. There are no formal records of his adoption. According to David, he had a good childhood and never had any reason to suspect he was not his parents' biological son. His mother always said she had no living relatives when asked about her family. Despite the shock he feels at the situation and how upset he is with her, David says he still loves his mother. He plans to submit his DNA to 23andMe in hopes of finding his biological family and getting a better understanding of the circumstances of his adoption. He also wants to meet Janice's 4 children from her first marriage. One of those children, Lynette, has spoken to her mother following her identification. She has not publicly spoken about the resolution to the case in great detail. She has stated that her mother is ill without specifying what illness she has and thanked investigators for their hard work, which finally brought her family answers. It's just so early. We've been looking for her for over 40 years. We're all in shock still, she told the Pick a United. Kim Wall was born on March 23, 1987, in Trollberg, Sweden, to Joachim and Ingrid Wall, both journalists. She had one sibling, Tom Wall. From a young age, Kim demonstrated exceptional intelligence and dedication to her goals. She pursued international relations at the London School of Economics, where she excelled. Her pursuit of knowledge continued as she enrolled in Columbia University's School of Journalism, known as the Oxbridge of Journalism, to earn a master's degree. Among her peers, Kim distinguished herself as one of the top students and graduated with honors. Her deep interest in people and their stories shone through in her journalism, as she was committed to going to great lengths to tell their stories and amplify their voices. Kim worked in Australia as a reporter for the Swedish Embassy, as a journalist at South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and also worked for a European Union delegation in India. Her works were published in many international publications, including the BBC, The Guardian, and the New York Times. Although Kim shuffled between New York and Beijing, she spent most of her time in Copenhagen, where she lived with her boyfriend, Ali Staub, a game and interaction designer. The two were deeply in love and had great plans together. One of the plans they had was to relocate to Beijing, China, but life had its own plans. On August 9, 2017, Kim was at her parents' house in Trelleborg, Sweden, spending time with her family, so they could take their yearly summer picture. Her family had taken a family portrait every summer since Kim was a year old, which means they had 29 pictures before August 9, 2017. Kim was also eager to see Uli, so she was in a hurry to leave for Copenhagen. Kim and Uli had plans to host their friends at their apartment the following day to say goodbye before they left for China on August 16, 2017. Kim's mother, Ingrid, knew Kim's presence was an opportunity to take the family picture, so she made sure they took the picture before she left. Even though Kim's brother Tom was sleepy because he had worked a night shift the previous day, unbeknownst to them, that would be the last picture they would all take together. On August 10, 2017, Uli and Kim readied their home for the house party. Soon friends gathered at their apartment, but before the merriment could begin, Kim got a call. The call was from Peter Madsen, a Danish inventor who built submarines. Peter and Kim had spoken on the phone briefly in the past about an interview. Kim wanted to interview Peter for a Wired magazine article she was writing. It was meant to be a very short interview to end her report, so she told Ole to let her be excused before the party started. Kim wanted to get the work done as soon as possible and get back to partying with her friends before it got too late. Kim apologized to her friends who were already gathered for the party and left for the interview. Peter Madsen was a well-known inventor who created 3 submarines. Not only that, but he had also built rocket ships and inspired a lot of people with his projects. Since the interview was about Peter's inventions, he invited Kim to ride with him on the UC-3 Nautilus, his submarine that was launched in 2008. Kim had a safe ride to the Copenhagen harbor, where Peter asked that they meet. By around 7 p.m., Kim was there. Peter was already waiting for her on the submarine, and Kim, who was initially scared to go on the submarine, found her courage and climbed gently onto it. By the time the gentle wind floated around her while standing by Peter on the tower of the submarine, she realized it wasn't a big deal. At 8 p.m., she texted Yule, "I'm still alive, BTW." She also texted Yule, "I love you, but I'm going down now." Not long after that text, Yule received another text from Kim that reads, "He bought cookies and coffee though." Although that was the last text from Kim, Yule didn't think there was a problem since he expected Kim to focus on her work. But soon, Yule started to get worried. Kim was supposed to be back early as promised, but it began to get later and later. When Yul could not reach Kim around 10 p.m., he started to panic. After calling everyone he could think of, he contacted the police at 1:43 a.m. and told them his girlfriend was missing. The Danish police began the search for Kim Wall, who was reported missing. They searched for the UC-3 Nautilus, the submarine that she boarded before she went missing, but Kim was not found. The members of the Danish Emergency Management Agency, DEMA, assisted the police in the search of the sea. All through the night, they searched far and wide looking for Kim. The divers covered a large dark part of the sea, going front, back, right, left, center, and deep into the sea while also using cadaver dogs. Around 5:31 a.m. on August 11, 2017, Kim's mother Ingrid got a call from Yul, who told her that Kim was missing. Both Ingrid and Joaquin panicked and could only hope that Kim was alive somewhere. The rigorous search continued, but the police would not find anything until around 10:30 p.m. At that time, a rescue helicopter found the sub in a bay southeast of Amager, near the Drogeden Lighthouse, at a depth of 22 feet south of Copenhagen. The police also found Peter Madsen, but Kim was nowhere to be found. Peter told the reporters that were present at the search that the submarine sank due to a faulty ballast tank. He also said he saw a fisherman's boat nearby, and he swam to the boat to escape. Peter's story never mentioned Kim, so the police questioned him about Kim's whereabouts. He said he dropped Kim off at a nearby restaurant on the night of August 10, 2017, before the accident. The police lifted the submarine for inspection and they discovered something suspicious. They discovered that the faulty ballast tank was tampered with on purpose. They also looked inside the submarine and they found traces of Kim's blood and her personal belongings. They questioned Peter more and he changed his story. He told the police that there was an accident when he lost his grip on a heavy hatch door that fell and hit Kim's head. Peter said there was so much blood where Kim landed, and that she had no pulse when he checked. The police knew immediately that they had to suspect Peter, but on what grounds? There was nothing tangible to hold on to. They were not even sure what really happened to Kim, since her body had not been found. 11 days after Kim Wall went missing, on August 21, 2017, a cyclist while riding across a beach south of Copenhagen made a grisly discovery. It was a human torso washed up onto the shore. The police department was called, and after examining the torso, they determined it belonged to Kim Wall, the Swedish journalist that had been missing for 11 days. The torso had been stabbed about 14 times in a horrific manner, and the rest of the body was not attached to it. Friends and family of Kim Wall then knew that their beloved is no more, but they still needed answers as to what happened to her on August 10, 2017. The police kept searching for answers, but found nothing until October 7, 2017, when divers found plastic bags in Classy Bay, less than a mile away from where Kim's torso was found. The plastic bags had metal scraps attached to them to prevent them from floating. And when the bags were opened, they contained Kim's head and legs. Peter was confronted again after these findings, and he changed his story again. This time he said Kim Wall died from toxic fumes while on his submarine. With Peter's conflicting stories, the police knew that he was hiding something. He also remained the only suspect in the case, as he was the last person that saw Kim alive, and he was also unable to provide clear details of what happened when they were together. Since Peter never confessed to Kim's murder, and there was no real evidence to hold anyone for it, no one was arrested. However, the police could not work based on their assumptions, so they proceeded with their investigation. The autopsy on Kim's body revealed that there was no blunt trauma to her head, which contradicted one of Peter's stories about a hatch hitting her head. The autopsy also revealed that Kim was bound and stabbed. It also showed that she had asphyxia, which means she was either strangulated or stabbed in her throat. With this evidence, the police had reasons to take Peter in for further questioning. During the investigation, his phone was searched and the investigators found out that Peter watched a video on August 9, 2017 that detailed a young woman in pain as she was slowly beheaded with a small knife. His search history also showed that he searched for how to erase all photos on the iPhone. The investigators also found videos on Peter's computer showing women being murdered. And witnesses came in to testify that Peter was seen watching videos of decapitation and practicing asphyxiation. According to the investigation, No traces of Peter's DNA was found on Kim's body, but traces of bodily fluids were found in the underpants, which were secured from Peter Madsen after the arrest. Under questioning, Peter denied finding pleasure while he was with Kim. Peter was born on January 12, 1971 to Annie and Carl Madsen. He spent his early life in Saby and Hong, Denmark. Annie was more than 30 years younger than Carl and had 3 other boys from 2 previous men. Allegedly, Carl abused his 3 stepsons and Annie left the marriage when Peter was 6 years old, taking with her all of her children. Years later, Peter returned to live with his father, with whom he shared an interest in rockets. While in school, Peter took a great interest in rocket fuel while studying physics and chemistry. He developed his first large rocket and launched it on March 3, 1986. He built it in his father's workshop and modeled it after the American ICBM MX Peacekeeper. The rocket did well, reaching a height of 100 meters before crashing. Fortunately, no one was hurt. In 1990, when Peter was 18 years old, he lost his father, but he never stopped experimenting and consulting engineers. He also joined the Danks Aim to Rocket Club, DRC Rocket Club in Copenhagen, but the other members gradually became disillusioned with him. DRC members claimed that saying his name would start the fire sprinkler system. He never finished any formal education, but took courses in welding and engineering to learn something about submarines. His enthusiasm yielded positive results as people, enterprises, and organizations saw promise in him and funded his lifestyle and work. He built 3 submarines, UC-1 Freya, UC-2 Kraka, and UC-3 Nautilus. The Nautilus was a privately built midget submarine launched on May 3, 2008 in Copenhagen, Denmark. Constructed over 3 years, it cost approximately $200,000 to build. On May 1, 2008, Peter co-founded Copenhagen Suborbitals with Danish architect Christian von Bengtsen. In June 2014, he left the project. Peter was responsible for the launch systems, launch pad, and booster rocket engines. Peter was already popular with his inventions, and a good number of people took interest in him. Unknown to them that Peter was a different person on the inside. His true self was only exposed via Kim Wall's murder. On January 26, 2018, 47-year-old Peter Madsen was charged with murder, indecent handling of a corpse due to the dismemberment, and assault due to the stabbing. The prosecution accused Peter of binding, hitting, cutting, and strangling Kim on his submarine on August 10, 2017. Peter did not admit that he had killed Kim throughout the investigation. On March 8, 2018, Peter's trial began and he pleaded not guilty to the charges. The psychiatric evaluation showed that Peter was a narcissistic psychopath, but not delusional or psychotic. On April 25, 2018, Peter was found guilty of all charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Peter was reported to have shown no remorse while in court. Instead, he occasionally stared at people in the courtroom to intimidate them. At one point, the Wall family was asked not to pass Peter in the courtroom because of the way he acted. While Peter admitted to dismembering Kim's body, he told the court, "I don't see how that mattered at the time, as she was dead." He maintained throughout the proceedings that her death was accidental. Even if Peter failed to confess, this sentencing brought closure to the family and friends of Kim, who never believed that she would be killed in a very close location to where she lived. They all knew Kim to be a brave journalist that was not afraid to go to dangerous places to get the information she needed for her work. If they ever worried about her, it would be because she traveled far and wide to work. Unbeknownst to them all, Cam would meet her untimely death in Copenhagen, the city where she lived. After Peter was sentenced to life imprisonment, he tried to appeal the sentence, but it wasn't granted. His wife, who he got married to in 2011, divorced him after he was arrested and asked that her identity be kept from the public. In August 2018, he was also attacked by an 18-year-old inmate, which had him hospitalized with the fear of staying in jail all his life. He escaped in October 20th, 2020 by threatening prison staff with a fake gun and fake explosives he had made while inside prison. The police chased after him and surrounded him in a nearby residential area, not far from her Sylvester prison. But the police could not move closer to him because the police thought he was armed with explosives. The bomb experts were summoned, and the police waited till they arrived. When the experts got there, they found out that it was all a decoy. Then the police arrested him and took him back to the prison. For that offense, he had to go to court again, and on February 9, 2021, a Copenhagen court sentenced him to an additional 21-month prison sentence for trying to escape. Although Peter was already serving life imprisonment, it looked like the extra sentence would not affect his jail term. The additional sentence, however, would play a role if a probation request were ever made. Peter maintained his innocence throughout the case, claiming the death was an accident, but in a documentary series, while Peter Madsen was secretly recorded, he reportedly confessed. According to the Danish newspaper, the series was based on more than 20 hours of telephone interviews with Peter from prison, which were taped without his knowledge. In one recording, when asked if he murdered Kim, he responds, "Yes." He also said, "There is only one who is guilty, and that is me." 3 years after Kim had been murdered, her parents, Joachim and Ingrid, who were also journalists, were determined to put out their daughter's story. They found writing Kim's story therapeutic and determined that the story would not reflect the moments of her death, but instead the person that Kim's family, friends, sources, and readers knew her to be. Ingrid says, "The book is our way of telling the world who Kim was, a daughter, a journalist, and a human being." The book is titled A Silenced Voice, which is a tapestry of past and present, at once a joyful chronicling of a life well lived and a family's reckoning with a life being extinguished. It follows Kim as she leaps from London to Cuba, New York to Haiti, and Beijing to Sri Lanka, collecting stories, bylines, and beloved friends as she goes. It also traces the hours, days, weeks after Ingrid and Joachim woke up to the news that their daughter is missing, and learned from the television that a stranger is being charged for the murder. Another thing that brought relief to the Wall family was the creation of the Kim Wall Memorial Fund, a grant created to support female journalists. Apart from the story written by Kim's parents, there are different TV presentations used to portray the life and death of Kim Wall. First is The Investigation, a Danish-language television dramatization created by Tobias Lindholm, which shows the criminal investigation of the case. It is a 6-part series that premiered on September 28, 2020, featuring different professional actors. The series was carefully scripted by engaging those involved in the investigation of the case. The investigation does not feature Peter or the crime itself, but focuses on the investigative work leading to his indictment and conviction. In September 2022, Netflix released a film titled Into the Deep, the Submarine Murder Case. Directed by Emma Sullivan, this film detailed the incident as well as covered the life of Peter Madsen, using the documentary footage of Peter, his friends, and interns that was being filmed to document his quest to launch a rocket ship into space, using his submarine as a command center. Ollie Stube, Kim's boyfriend, found it difficult to comment after the death of his beloved. But years after, he spoke about Kim and emphasized how much of a good human she was. The case of Kim's murder is a disturbing one that shows how much wickedness lies in the heart of humans. It also prompts us to think about how many women have been endangered while working in their various fields. What did you think about this case? Do you think Peter Madsen got what he deserved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. The hobbies Sherry Black enjoyed in her youth played a key role in shaping her fulfilling adult life. With her parents owning a bowling alley, Sherry developed her bowling skills and became a proficient player. She participated in several competitive bowling leagues and traveled across the United States for competitions. During one of these leagues, she met Earl Black, who would become her husband. The couple married in April of 1965, and Sherry later combined their mutual passion for the outdoors and animals into a career as a docent at the Hogle Zoo in Salt Lake City, Utah. Sherry and Earl had 2 children, Heidi and Jason. Jason tragically passed away in 1989 at the age of 18. Heidi would go on to marry a man named Greg Miller and had 6 children, who were all adored by Sherry and Earl. Heidi raised her children in a home next door to her parents so that Sherry and Earl could be an active part of their grandchildren's daily lives. The fall of 2010 was a time full of changes for Sherry and her family. Sherry and Earl had 1 great-granddaughter, and their first great-grandson was due to be born in the spring. Their oldest grandson had just recently arrived in Chile, where he would be serving as a missionary for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Sherry and Earl's daughter, Heidi, had married into a prominent Utah family who owned numerous car dealerships, as well as the Utah Jazz NBA team. While the Blacks were much more low profile, they worked hard for what money they had, and they were eventually able to turn their interests into business ventures. Sherry had a lifelong love of reading and was able to build a business selling books. Earl worked making custom knives and pool tables. The growing space they needed for their businesses led to Sherry and Earl building a store connected to their home of almost 40 years, which was tucked back from a busy 8-lane highway in South Salt Lake, Utah. They worked alongside each other in the store they named B&W Billiards and Books. November 30th, 2010 started out as a normal day for Earl Black. However, his day and the rest of his life abruptly went off track shortly before 2 o'clock that afternoon when he arrived at the store he shared with his wife. When he went inside, he discovered Sherry's body. A pair of scissors was lodged in her chest, and there were lacerations on her head and her neck. She was partially naked, and later examination of her body would find signs that she had been assaulted after she was killed. In addition to being stabbed, she had also been beaten. A distraught Earl called 911, and authorities were sued on the scene. Earl was taken to the police station, where he met with for the rest of the day and most of the evening. The investigation into Sherry's death was stymied early on because no one could identify a motive for the murder. When police canvassed the neighborhood, everyone described Sherry as the ideal neighbor. She was quiet but very friendly and never caused any problems in the neighborhood. There were no signs of forced entry at the scene. Robbery did not appear to be the motive for the murder because cash was still in the register, but there was no way of knowing if any valuable books had been taken from the store. While there was a digital record of some of the books Sherry owned because she was offering them for sale on Amazon, there were no such records for the books she planned to sell directly. Sherry kept no records of the books she had in her collection, instead keeping her inventory in her head, which was a common enough practice, according to some of her acquaintances in the used book business. Sherry had been selling books for approximately a decade at the time of her death. A large part of her business involved sourcing used books at thrift stores and estate sales. Thanks to her lifelong love of reading, she had a talent for being able to discern which books were valuable and which ones were not worth reselling. She would sell used children's books and novels by listing them on Amazon.com. Most of the items Sherry sold online were not particularly valuable, with a notable exception being a hardcover edition of John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, which she had listed for sale on Amazon for just over $2,700 at the time of her death. Sherry was also involved in the world killer had stolen a valuable book. Sherry's bookstore did not run on a traditional retail model. She had almost no customers walk in off the street and almost exclusively bought and sold books at the shop by appointment. This allowed her to run personal errands or search for new books to sell during normal business hours. Sherry had an impeccable reputation amongst other booksellers and dealers of LDS literature, as well as with her customers. She was known for her integrity, and her customers would come back to sell to her again and again because she was always fair in her transactions. She cared about books and protecting the history they contained, but also about the people who trusted her enough to be her customers. Sherry was unknowingly involved in one criminal transaction, something she was horrified to learn of after the fact. In February of 2009, she paid a 20-year-old named Lauren Nielsen $20,000 for 14 rare books connected to the early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, including a second edition of the Book of Mormon. Nielsen had sold books to her before and had later purchased some of them back from her. Nielsen's father was a church president in a polygamous offshoot church. In March of 2009, he noticed that several of the books in his collection of rare LDS texts were missing. He reviewed his security footage and saw his son Lauren removing the books from his personal library on February 20th. Lauren had been at the home, which also served as a church meeting place, for a funeral that day. The elder Nielsen confronted his son about the books, and Lauren admitted to taking them and selling them at B&W Billiards and Books. He then threatened his father, telling him that he would not be happy with the chain of events that would unfold if he contacted the police. Lauren claimed this was because he was a member of a local gang. Lauren's father still called the police, who in turn contacted Sherry Black. She was very upset to learn that she had purchased stolen property. She told the police the approximate value of the book she had purchased from Lauren was $45,000, a figure confirmed by another book dealer. Sherry was fully cooperative with police when she learned about the theft. She had only sold one of the books, a first edition of the French version of the Book of Mormon, to another book dealer for $10,000. She returned the rest of the stolen books as soon as she was notified that they were stolen. Nielsen pled guilty to theft and theft by deception in April of 2009 and sentenced to 90 days in jail. This led to speculation that he may have killed Sherry in retaliation for her cooperation in the investigation into his theft. Nielsen was booked into the Salt Lake County Jail for violating his parole shortly after Sherry's murder, but police would not confirm if he was being investigated in connection with the crime. Sherry's killer had left behind his blood, palm print, and fingerprints at the crime scene. Police believed he had cut his hand when he was in the process of stabbing Sherry, resulting in his blood being found at the scene. Nielsen's DNA and fingerprints were not a match to this evidence, eliminating him as a suspect. Police had one other piece of evidence left behind at the scene, an Armani exchange belt. The belt, which may have been a knockoff, did not belong to anyone in the Black family. Its size indicated it would fit someone with a 36 to 38-inch waist. There was a sticker on the back of the buckle, printed with the number 323. Authorities hoped that this number was an inventory or thrift store number but could never track it down. Sherry's husband, Earl, was devastated by her death. He never slept in the home he had shared with Sherry for nearly 4 decades again after her murder, and he began missing the family events that had been so central to his life with Sherry. Sherry's grandchildren mourned the fact that their children would not grow up with Sherry. Sherry's killer to justice and to preserve her memory. They established the Sherry Black Foundation to educate police departments about emerging forensic techniques. They maintained a website with information about the case and regularly put up billboards asking for tips. The reward they offered for information in the case eventually grew to $250,000 million. While police had the killer's DNA, they could not find a match to it in the FBI's national database. As years passed with no suspect identified in the case, they eventually turned to the novel DNA techniques advocated for by the Black family. On the 7th anniversary of Sherry's murder, the South Salt Lake Police Department held a press conference, at which they released composite images of what the man responsible for Sherry's murder may look like at different ages. The images were generated by Parabod Nanolabs using their DNA phenotyping technology, which uses DNA profiles to identify certain features that the contributor of that DNA may have. This was the first time the technology was used in a case in Utah. The effort did result in numerous tips being called in, but did not lead to Sherry's killer being identified. Just a few years later, investigators turned to genetic genealogy to help them identify a suspect in Sherry's case. They were able to narrow down their suspect pool to a single family. They then contacted one member of this family, who agreed to meet with investigators and provide details about their family tree. This effort led to the identification of a potential suspect. He was then placed under surveillance and followed to a public place where police surreptitiously collected a sample of his DNA from a discarded item. The DNA was tested and found to be a match to the DNA found at Sherry's crime scene. On October 7, 2020, a direct DNA sample was collected from the suspect and submitted to the Utah Bureau of Forensic Services. The following day, they confirmed that it was this man's DNA found at the crime scene. On October 10, 2020, just weeks before 10th anniversary of Sherry's murder, this individual was arrested and charged with the crime. He was publicly identified as this 29-year-old Adam Deurbrouck of Orem, Utah. Following his arrest and after he was advised of his rights, Deurbrouck confessed to Sherry's murder. He further stated that he had followed the case online and in the local media and had been aware that the DNA evidence had been recovered at the scene. Deurbrouck's fingerprints and palm print would later be matched to those from the crime scene. At the time of the murder, Deurbrouck had been just 19 years old and living less than a mile away from Sherry's home and store at the home of his biological mother. Deurbrouck's criminal record stretches back to his teenage years. In 2006, when he was just 14 years old, he was convicted of attempted rape and aggravated assault in Davis County Juvenile Court. It is unclear if Deurbrouck's DNA was collected after this conviction or if it was expunged from the database when he reached the age of majority. For either reason, it was not in the offender database when the samples from Sherry Black's case were run through the system in 2010. Deurbrouck was again convicted of a crime as a juvenile in 2008 at the age of 16 in Iron County. This conviction was for aggravated assault with weapon or force. Deurbrouck ended up at a juvenile facility in Salt Lake County, where he participated in a program which allowed him to complete his junior and senior years of high school while in the care of the juvenile justice system. On September 16, 2010, Deurbrouck shoplifted 2 CDs from a Shopko store in West Valley City. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor theft charge on October 27th. He was sentenced to 60 days in jail, but the judge suspended the sentence, and Deurbrouck was given probation. Just over a month later, Sherry Black would be killed. While he was now a legal adult, Deurbrouck was still in the custody of the Utah Division of Juvenile Justice Services, and following his shoplifting conviction, he was placed in a foster home under the jurisdiction of Pioneer Youth and Adult Community Services. It was while he was in one of these homes that he committed his last known criminal act. In January of 2011, he stole watches from a jewelry box in his foster home. He later told police he had taken the watches because he had caught 2 men he worked with smoking marijuana and dealing pills. They told him that he would be fired if he could not prove that he was not going to report them, so he took the watches to give to them as collateral so that he could keep his job. The watches were recovered, and the man Deurbrouck had given them to was convicted of misdemeanor theft. Deurbrouck was sentenced to 6 months in jail, and he began serving that sentence at the end of March of 2011. Deurbrouck's only run-in with the law after 2011 was an infraction for failing to have insurance, which was ultimately dismissed. Deurbrouck's DNA was not entered in the criminal database after either of his theft convictions because he pleaded guilty to a Class B misdemeanor in each case. In the state of Utah, only individuals convicted of felonies and Class A misdemeanors are required to submit samples of their DNA. Deurbrouck formally pled guilty to aggravated murder in 3rd District Court on October 4, 2021. His sentencing hearing was then held on February 23, 2022. At that hearing, Deurbrouck's defense team asked the judge to sentence him to 25 years to life in prison, which would leave open the possibility of him one day being released on parole. They argued that Deurbrouck had cooperated by pleading guilty. They also argued that the murder had occurred because of the anger issues Deurbrouck had as a result of his difficult childhood, during which he endured things which they said no child should go through. This was presumably in reference to Deurbrouck's adoptive father, Joseph Deurbrouck. He was arrested in 2002 for child pornography charges related to his child modeling photography business. He would serve time in both federal prison and the Utah State Prison after being convicted of charges of child pornography and sexually abusing children. Adam Deurbrouck's lawyers argued that while this in no way excused his actions, it should be taken into account when he was sentenced. According to Sherry's family, she would have felt sympathy for Deurbrouck and his circumstances had he made different choices. She helped anyone she could, any way she could. Sherry's oldest grandchild, Courtney Hawks, told the court, "There's the real irony of all of this. She would have been an advocate for this perpetrator if only he'd chosen a different path. Instead, he preyed upon her. He brutally took out all his anger and frustration and rage on her like she was nothing, and she was not nothing." Numerous members of Sherry's family addressed the court during the hearing, providing stories of Sherry's life and how difficult the past 11 years had been without her. They requested that Deurbrouck be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. They had worried about him being free for the 10 years after the murder and prior to his arrest and could not move on if they knew he could be free to hurt someone else in the future. Before sentencing Deurbrouck, 3rd District Judge Randall Scanchi stated that he felt sorrow at both the loss of Sherry's life and the impact it had on her loving family, as well as the fact that Deurbrouck had no such support system. While he believed Deurbrouck was sorry for what he had done, he also believed that the crime was egregious and spontaneous. He sentenced Deurbrouck to life in prison with no possibility of parole. Sherry's family issued a public statement following Deurbrouck's sentencing. While this sentence delivers a sense of justice, no punishment imposed can heal the pain or fill the void created by Deurbrouck when he chose to take the life of our beloved Sherry. The statement said in part, although he took her life, he could not take her soul, which lives on and is part of the love, beauty, kindness, and talents that her husband, daughter, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren will carry forward. Her legacy is a gift to future generations. The life she led and the influence she had can never be taken away. Crystal Schartzer was born in 1980 to Doug and Mary Lynn Schartzer. Although details of her early years are sparse, her life changed dramatically when she met Damien Argue at age 16. They were introduced on a blind date arranged by mutual friends in Fenton in 1996. At that time, Crystal was focused on her education, attending college with the goal of becoming a nurse, while Damien worked sporadically helping his uncle with carpet installation. On the day they first met, Crystal and Damien experienced an undeniable connection, leading them to tie the knot in 1999. Shortly after their wedding, they welcomed 2 children, Damien Jr. and Celeste, and soon their family was complete when the 3rd baby boy, Raven, came into their lives. However, the happiness in their lives began to slowly dissipate. While their family appeared to be functioning well on the surface, there were underlying issues that deeply troubled Crystal's family. Following a decline in their relationship, Crystal decided to live with her children at her parents' home in the city of Holly, Colorado. From June 2003, communication between Crystal and Damien dwindled, and their once strong bond began to crumble. The situation eventually escalated to the brink of divorce, and by mid-2004, the divorce proceedings were nearing completion. However, on August 3, 2004, an unexpected turn occurred when Damien visited Crystal's home late in the night and assisted her in packing for a move back to Aurora, Colorado. The next morning, when Crystal's parents woke up, they discovered that Crystal and the children had disappeared. A week later, Crystal reached out to her father, informing him that she was in Aurora and intended to live with Damien. However, her parents were deeply unhappy about this decision. The couple, along with their children, began their fresh start in Colorado, and for weeks life seemed normal. However, after 5 months on January 18, 2005, the house that once held hope became a living hell for the mother of 3. In the early hours of January 18th, Crystal and Damien's first 2 children, Damien Jr. and Celeste, were around 6 years old at the time, sought refuge in their neighbor's home. The neighbor, whose name remained undisclosed, was taken aback by the children's evident fear and unease. They confided in him that Crystal and Damien were involved in a heated argument. Concerned, he promptly went to Damien's home to investigate the situation. On his way, the neighbor noticed Damien driving away in Crystal's car. He entered the house hoping to find Crystal and her 16-month-old baby, Raven, but the scene that greeted him was beyond his worst nightmares. Both mother and child were lying lifeless in a pool of blood, having been stabbed and strangled to death in one of the home's bedrooms. Horrified at what he had seen, he called 911. Upon arrival, the police swiftly began investigating the crime scene. Realizing that Damien had fled, they promptly initiated a search to trace Damien's whereabouts. Thankfully, after just a few hours, they managed to apprehend 27-year-old Damien Argue, who was found in Crystal's car only a few miles away from the scene of the crime. After his arrest, Damien was taken into custody, and the interrogation commenced. During the interrogation, the interrogators had numerous questions for Damien. However, he initially struggled to share, choking up as he visualized the horrific events that had transpired however. What surprised the interrogators the most was Damien's complete lack of remorse. Even though he initially seemed like he was regretting it, it didn't take much time for his emotions to completely change. He answered their questions as if the heinous act was inconsequential, showing no emotions or remorse. All he seemed to want was a cigarette, seemingly indifferent to the gravity of the crime he had committed. Indeed, it appeared that all Damien wanted was to smoke, possibly to cope with or mask any feelings of guilt, if he had any at all. As he smoked, Damien finally mustered the courage to ask the question. As the interrogators held hope that he might be coming back to his senses, Damien finally confessed. For the first time, he exhibited emotions, but unfortunately, they were not the emotions one would hope to see. Despite their efforts, the interrogation failed to yield the confession they sought. A confession that Damien had stabbed his wife, an innocent baby. It seemed that guilt was finally catching up with Damien. The news of Crystal and his son's death, relayed by someone else, appeared to bring him back to reality. Slowly but surely, Damien began to accept the horrifying truth and the weight of his actions. Following Damien's confession to the crime, he began cooperating with the investigators regarding the case. The police successfully recovered the murder weapon, a knife used in the tragic incident. However, how they recovered it was never mentioned. According to law enforcement, both Crystal Arguello and her son lost their lives due to multiple stab wounds. Moreover, the evidence revealed a tragic truth. It appeared that Crystal had bravely attempted to protect her baby during the horrifying ordeal. The murder, which involved both strangling and stabbing, took a gruesome 10 to 20 minutes. It was later clarified that Damien first attempted to strangle Crystal. As Crystal lay on the floor, she valiantly shielded her baby with her body, but tragically, they both succumbed to the fatal stabbings. During an April 2005 preliminary hearing, a detective revealed a disturbing motive behind the horrific crime. Damien was allegedly upset as he suspected that he might not be the father of the baby. Moreover, he admitted to smoking crack cocaine before the tragic incident, which played a role in his erratic and violent behavior. On July 15, 2005, in Adams County Court, Damien entered a guilty plea to 2 counts of first-degree murder. By pleading guilty, he avoided a trial and also the possibility of facing the death penalty. However, Damien will spend the rest of his life at the Colorado State Penitentiary with no possibility of parole. Damien's sentencing took place on September 16, 2005. Damien Michael Arguello, 27, received 2 life sentences for murdering his wife and their 16-month-old son. He will spend the remainder of his life at the Colorado State Penitentiary with no chance of parole. Crystal's parents, Doug and Mary Lynn Chartzer, were present to confront the man who had taken their daughter and grandson from them. Doug Chartzer expressed his anguish, stating that Damien showed no genuine remorse for his actions. While Damien appeared to cry, it seemed more like he was feeling sorry for himself rather than truly remorseful for the horrific deeds he had committed. Since their daughter's tragic death, the Chartres took on the responsibility of raising Crystal's children, Damien Jr. and Celeste. Despite the children's memories of that fateful night, the Chartreusers handled the matter delicately and refrained from pushing them to talk about it. They ensured that the children received ongoing counseling to help them cope with the trauma they had experienced. Chartreuse vividly remembered the conversation he had with his daughter and grandson on January 18, 2005, the day of the murder. Everything seemed normal during their talk, and little did he know it would be their last. In that poignant telephone conversation, Chartzer's heart was warmed as he heard his 16-month-old grandson, Raven, call him Papa for the first time, cherishing a precious memory of their bond that would forever remain etched in his heart. Adams County District Attorney Don Quick, having served as a prosecutor for 18 years, expressed that this was the most horrific crime he had ever encountered. Some of the evidence was withheld until the conclusion of the case. But he now wants the Charterers to find solace in knowing that their daughter's final moments were spent heroically trying to protect her baby. Quick was shocked to discover that the baby had been intentionally stabbed rather than accidentally. Finding comfort in the closure of the legal proceedings, Crystal's parents felt a slight sense of justice, knowing that Damien will forever be behind bars. So do you think the Chartzer family got the justice they sought, or do you think Damien should have been sentenced to death? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Born on February 25, 2000 in Louisville, Kentucky, to Scott Riel Jr. and Chelsea Riel, James Riel spent his early years in Taylorsville, Kentucky, with his siblings Jessica Culber, Jordan Riel, and Jaden Canaster until he was 8. He then moved to Fairlawn, Ohio to continue his education. After graduating from Fairlawn High School and Upper Valley Career Center in Piqua, Ohio, in 2018, James demonstrated a diverse range of interests and passions. He pursued basketball and bodybuilding with great dedication and also took on the role of mentor, inspiring and guiding others in their health and fitness journeys. In addition to his diverse activities, he worked as a steelworker, a profession that complemented his hands-on approach to life. Moreover, his fascination with cars was evident in his ownership of 3 vehicles. James also found a light in playing video games. Apart from his hobbies, James also had a high school romance. He met Allison Duckro in high school, and they quickly went from friends to being in a relationship. The first year seemed great, but eventually the relationship turned toxic. Allison grew tired of James' hurtful words and the way he treated her with disrespect. James, on the other hand, always seemed to focus on Allison's flaws and made her feel worthless. The situation got worse, leading Allison to break up with him and decide to move on by the beginning of 2021. But James wasn't ready to let go. Despite continuing to mistreat her with his words, he couldn't seem to forget Allison and started trying to reach out to her bit by bit. Allison, however, was determined to keep him out of her life for good. Around 18 months after their breakup on July 30th, 2022, James sent her a voice note asking how she was doing. Little did she know, this voice message would be the last thing he ever said to her. Stacey Duckro and her daughter Allison had just gone shopping and returned to the home at 2907 North Cuthar Road in Sydney. Approaching their porch, they observed an unfamiliar car entering their property and parking behind their own vehicle. Despite not recognizing the driver at the moment, they proceeded to open the door to their house and went inside. Moments after they entered, they heard the doorbell ring. James was standing on their porch waiting for them to open the door. However, Allison's family was resolute in not letting him in under any circumstances. The family finally felt a moment of relief when James left the porch. However, their peace was short-lived as he returned after only a few minutes. This time determined not to leave until he saw Allison. As soon as James tried to push the door, Allison, who was hiding inside the house, dialed 911. At this point, Allison and her family were frightened. To stop James, Allison's father, Mitchell Duckro, shouted at him, repeatedly asking him to leave their house. However, James remained resolute, persistently attempting to force the door open. Although the police had been notified, it was taking them some time to arrive at the scene. Unfortunately, the door was not going to hold up until their arrival, as James was fully determined to break it down and confront his ex-girlfriend. Just as the door was on the verge of giving way, it happened. 3 gunshots rang out from the firearm that Allison's father Mitchell was clutching. James was pushed back by the force of the bullets, and he ultimately fell in the walkway in the front of the garage. As he lay in the walkway, neighbors attempted to assess the situation, though none ventured far enough to confirm his condition. Amidst this, the officers from the Shelby County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene. Inside the Ducker house, the family remained unsettled by the unfolding events. Upon entering, the police discovered 3 spent shells scattered on the floor. Allison, who had been terrified, finally found some relief and embraced her father, believing that he had rescued her from danger. However, the outcome was different for 22-year-old James Riel. In his pursuit of meeting with his ex-girlfriend, James lost his life. While Allison and the Duckro family could now finally breathe a sigh of relief with their nightmare finally ending, a stark contrast was evident. James lay lifeless, his family still unaware of the tragic news that would soon engulf them. Following James' death, the Duckworth family was brought in for interrogation. After the rites were read and Allison's introduction was made, the interrogators started asking questions about James and their relationship. Next on the list of questions was whether James had any involvement with drugs. Now it was time to determine whether James was a person who used to make threats or if he had any history of violence. During another interrogation, Allison's father was asked if he had any knowledge of the messages that James had sent to Allison. Although Allison received the voicemail in which James clearly expressed the desire to talk to her, she was scared. Surprisingly, she never informed her parents about it. The reason behind her reluctance to do so despite her fear remains unclear. While there might have been potential for a deeper mystery in the case, it was kept straightforward. James was the culprit and Allison was the victim. However, according to James' sister Jessica, things were entirely different. Jessica believed that no one would ever discover the true reason why her brother went to meet Allison that day. While there might be suspicions that James intended to harm Allison, it would ultimately remain an assumption. This side of the story was never heard, as he was killed without being given an opportunity to speak. The actions taken by the Duckro family were indeed swift and decisive, seemingly without attempting to understand the true purpose behind James's visit. Furthermore, James was unarmed, and the entirety of the voicemail suggested that he had no intention of violence, but rather was expressing his longing for Allison. Here is the complete voicemail that he had sent to Allison the day before his death. Even though the motive behind James' action remained unclear, the decision was final. Shelby County Prosecutor Tim Sell announced that the jury would not be pursuing charges against Mitchell Duckro for the shooting of James Riel on July 31, 2022. In September 2022, a Shelby County grand jury voted 8-1 not to indict Mitchell Duckro on charges related to James' death. The decision was based on Ohio's Stand Your Ground legislation, which stipulates that homeowners are not legally obligated to retreat before using a firearm. Following the news that Mitchell would not be charged with the killing of James, the family of the latter launched a Facebook page to demand justice for the deceased young man. Amidst the global criticism and accusations against James, with some even suggesting he deserved his fate, the Riel family remains resolute in their unwavering pursuit of justice. People's beliefs might differ, and so might their actions. So what is your opinion on this case? Were the actions of the Duckro family justified, or was James an unintended victim? His simple desire for conversation leading to a tragic outcome. Feel free to share your opinions. We would like to hear from you. Coined the longest-serving wrongfully incarcerated woman in U.S. history, Kathy Woods was released in 2015. She had been serving 35 years of her life sentence when she saw a program about DNA testing. And with the help of a public defender, she petitioned to have the DNA evidence in her case retested. She was later informed that DNA at the crime scene linked to a man named Rodney Halbauer, who was incarcerated and already serving a life sentence in Oregon. Woods had been convicted on a manslaughter charge based on confession, but Woods had been a diagnosed schizophrenic since the age of 12, and her lawyers argued that she should never have been questioned without legal representation. She had gotten every detail about the crime incorrectly and was unable to replicate a not necessary in the crime. 3 years after the crime had turned cold, Woods had been committed into a psychiatric hospital and had wanted a private room, but was told only dangerous patients got private rooms. So she told a counselor she had been involved in the disappearance of a missing woman. However, she didn't give any information about the crime that hadn't been in the local news. This seemed to be the only motivation behind the confession. Following the DNA evidence, she was exonerated and later released, having spent nearly half of her life in prison. She was awarded $3 million in a partial settlement from the state of Nevada for the wrongful incarceration. Her attorney told media, "We are pleased we have been able to reach a partial settlement, and we are hoping the settlement money will go towards her care, which is what she needs." Today, Woods is living a quiet life in the Puget Sound, renting a small apartment close to her caretaker. Rodney Halbauer is expected to be charged and tried, and the correct person will be imprisoned for the manslaughter charge. In December 1981, 2 men disguised as telephone repairmen gained entry into the home of an elderly coin collector, Ed Davis, and his wife, Grace, in Sacramento, California. The couple were bound and both residents were shot. Ed passed as a result of his wounds, but Grace survived. The 2 men got away with 6 suitcases of silver. Later, an anonymous phone call accused a man named Gary Moss. When investigators arrested Moss, his wife told police a woman named Gloria planned the whole robbery. Gloria Killian was a law student in her 30s. She worked at a coin shop and had known Ed Davis. After hearing on the news of his passing, she had been approached by police to come by for questioning. She'd never had any trouble with the law and saw no issue with going alone and not having a lawyer with her. That day, she had been arrested after several hours of questioning. She told police she was innocent and had never met Moss, but the police had held her for months in connection to the crime despite no tangible evidence. There had been a preliminary hearing for Gloria, and she was released due to little evidence. However, when Moss was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole, he contacted the Sacramento sheriff to see if he could reduce his sentence in exchange for testifying against Gloria and a man named Stephen DeSantis. During DeSantis' trial, he stated he had never met Gloria and she was not involved in the crime. In Gloria's trial, Mass testified against her, and based on his testimony, Gloria was sentenced to 32 years in prison with the possibility of a death sentence. Mass's conviction was reduced to 25 years. It wasn't until the 1990s that a private investigator uncovered documents outlining Mass's deal. This was evidence that prosecution should have given to Gloria's defense team in her trial. Mass had actually testified in that trial that he had not been given a deal in exchange for his testimony against Gloria. With that, Gloria Killian's conviction was overturned. She was released in 2002. 20 years of being an accused mastermind of a murderer, Gloria was a free woman. In 2008, the State Bar of California brought prosecutorial misconduct disciplinary charges against the prosecutor, Christopher Cleland, for failing to disclose the exculpatory evidence to defense and was admonished from the bar. Killian has raised money to help women in prison. She founded Action Committee for Women in Prison, which is a nonprofit that advocates for humane, compassionate treatment for incarcerated women. She wrote a book about her ideal, and she is a keynote speaker at many law schools using her voice, story, and platform to bring awareness to gross negligence in the legal system. On July 9, 1977, a police patrol officer saw a young girl standing on a curb near a restaurant center in Homeland, Chicago. Kathleen Crowell worked at the mall at a fast food restaurant. She was disheveled and told the officer she had been walking through the parking lot and a car with 3 young men in it stopped. 2 men jumped out and grabbed her and threw her into the back seat. She described being assaulted in the vehicle and a man carving letters into her stomach using a broken beer bottle. The officer took her to the hospital where she was treated for the lacerations and DNA was collected. She said that police pressured her to pick someone out of a mugshot book, and she picked Gary Dotson, a man who somewhat matched the composite sketch police had done up based on her description. Although she said the man who attacked her was clean-shaven, Dotson was arrested anyway even though he had a mature mustache. Gary Dotson was a high school dropout and living with his mother and his sisters in Country Club Hills in Chicago. He was arrested and charged based on the identification with aggravated assault and kidnapping and sentenced to 25 to 50 years in prison. In 1982, Crowell married and became deeply religious. She had relocated to New Hampshire, and in 1985, she confessed to a pastor that when she was 16, she had relations with her then boyfriend and was concerned she would get pregnant. She was living with foster parents and had needed contraceptive, but thought they would kick her out if she told the truth. Using a scene from a bromance novel, Sweet Savage Love, she came up with a plan to explain an unwanted pregnancy. She hadn't wanted anyone to actually get arrested due to her lie, but once it was told, she felt she couldn't go back. She felt that the police had pressured her to pick someone, so at random, she selected Gary Dotson. Her pastor convinced her to correct what she had done, but prosecutors were uninterested in revisiting the case. Crowell's lawyer had needed to contact local media, and only after was there enough pressure to push to reopen the investigation. Chicago Governor James Thompson personally presided over the clemency hearing for which Dotson was denied. In 1987, a defense attorney, Thomas Breen, agreed to take Dotson's case. In 1988, DNA testing was done which proved Dotson had not assaulted Crowell, and the DNA matched Crowell's former boyfriend. In 1989, prosecution finally admitted their error and joined Dotson's defense in vacating the conviction. And finally, in 2003, Dotson was awarded a full pardon based on innocence. He was awarded a $120,000 by the state of Illinois for wrongful conviction. Crell had also co-written a book based on her experiences and gave $17,000 in profits to Dotson in exchange for his promise not to sue her. In 2008, Crell passed of breast cancer. Her husband spoke on her behalf about how sorry she was to have negatively impacted Dotson's life. Dotson had served 26 years in prison. Upon release, he had gotten married, had a daughter. His post-prison life hasn't been easy. He struggled with alcoholism, but hopes to become a counselor. He is now trying to live a quiet life, choosing to stay under the radar and put the experiences past him. George Nelson Shaw Sr. was born in West Virginia in October 1936. He met his wife, Norma, in 1959, and they had their first date at the Florida State Fair on Valentine's Day. They married just a few months later in June. Their marriage lasted nearly 59 years and produced 3 children, 9 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren. George served as a deacon at his church and enjoyed hunting, reading, and gardening. He had a distinguished career in the United States Air Force, serving for 28 years and retiring as a senior master sergeant. After his Air Force retirement, he worked at the Lewis A. Johnson Medical Center, a Veterans Administration hospital. George was admitted to the hospital on March 22, 2018, due to low blood pressure and dehydration. He had been involved in a bowling league just 2 weeks prior. Given that his condition was not life-threatening, he was placed on floor 3A in the medical surgical wing rather than in the intensive care unit. After receiving fluids, his health initially improved, and he was able to walk the hospital halls. However, for days into his stay, his health took a severe turn when he experienced a hypoglycemic event, causing his blood sugar level to drop unexpectedly. Although medical staff managed to stabilize his blood sugar temporarily, it soon dropped again. From there, George's health deteriorated. He spent the last few days of his life seemingly trapped inside his own body, unable to care for himself or communicate with his family. He passed away on April 10, 2018 at the age of 81. George's family found his abrupt passing suspicious and demanded that an autopsy be performed. After finding evidence of heart disease, however, the medical examiner who performed the autopsy wrote off his cause of death as congestive heart failure. The Shaw family's concerns over George's sudden death were seemingly validated several months later when officials requested permission from the family to have George's body exhumed and sent to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware for further examination. They gave permission, and when a second autopsy was performed on January 16, 2019, it also found that George did have heart disease. However, it was not the cause of his death. During the autopsy, unexplained injection marks were located on George's body. Testing of the tissues surrounding the injection sites indicated that George had been injected with insulin at these 4 locations. George was not diabetic and he had never been prescribed insulin. The Armed Forces medical examiner ruled that the manner of George's death was a homicide and its cause was exogenous insulin administration. This means that George was intentionally injected with medically unnecessary insulin with the goal of driving down his blood sugar, leading to the hypoglycemic event that led to his death. 84-year-old Archie Dale Edgell was admitted to the same floor of the same hospital on the same day as George Shaw. Archie was an Army veteran who served during the Korean War. He was a talented musician who could play almost any instrument he picked up. He served as a street water commissioner for the city of Salem, West Virginia for several years. He was married to his wife, Frances, for over 60 years, and they had 5 children and eventually numerous grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Archie had been sent to Johnson Medical Center by his primary care physician for issues stemming from his dementia. He was being cared for at the federally run Veterans Administration Hospital while it was being determined if his dementia had advanced to the point where he should be admitted to the West Virginia Veterans Nursing Facility, a state-run facility located next door. Archie had not been in serious condition when he arrived at the hospital, and he had walked into the building on his own. Archie did have type 2 diabetes, so his blood sugar was tested upon his admission. His reading was slightly elevated at 165. The hospital did not administer insulin to try to lower it. Archie's blood sugar plummeted after he had been in the hospital with readings in the 20s and 30s for the next several days with no explanation. The medications Archie had been prescribed to control his blood sugar were held during his hospital stay, and he was instead given dextrose and medications to raise his blood sugar level back to normal levels. Archie passed away on March 26, 2018, 4 days after he was admitted to the Johnson Medical Center. His medical team had no explanation for his hypoglycemia or his death, but he was buried without further investigation. Archie's family had felt that something was suspicious about his death. When investigators came to meet with them in November of 2018 to discuss exhuming his body for further testing, Archie's son Steve's first words to them when they arrived were, "They killed my father, didn't they?" Archie's wife, Frances, lived to learn that her husband, Steph, was considered suspicious, but passed away in April of 2019, 2 months before the report detailing the findings of the examination of his remains was released. Her son, Steve, believes she died of a broken heart. The examination of Archie's body revealed that, like George Shaw, there were several injection sites on his body that could not be explained. Also, like George, the areas surrounding these injection marks tested positive for insulin. The new autopsy report stated that these findings were suspicious for unprescribed exogenous insulin administration. The investigators looking into these suspicious deaths had told George and Archie's families that numerous deaths of veterans at the Johnson Medical Center were being re-examined. The scale of the problem was not made known to the public until August of 2019, when the daughter of another veteran treated at Johnson Medical Center submitted a statement of claim to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. Felix Kirk McDermott was a veteran of the Vietnam War. He had retired from the United States Army with the rank of sergeant and then went on to work as a truck driver and to serve in the Pennsylvania Army National Guard. His daughter, Melanie, described him in 2021 as a proud Army veteran, an ornery character who would give anybody a helping hand. 82-year-old Kirk had been admitted to Johnson Medical Center on April 6, 2018 because he was suffering from pneumonia. He had dementia diagnosis and also had a physical impairment that had been brought on by a stroke. His health initially improved following his admission to the hospital, but on the morning of April 9th, he suddenly began experiencing shortness of breath. Blood tests showed that his blood sugar was critically and profoundly low, according to the later claim. Medical staff could not raise his blood sugar, and Kirk passed away around 9 o'clock that morning. Hospital staff never explained to Kirk's family that he had experienced an unexplained hypoglycemic event. Several months later, Kirk's family was contacted and finally notified that he may not have died as the result of natural causes. His remains were disinterred and taken to Dover Air Force Base to be examined. Again, unexplained injection marks were found on his body and testing showed that he had been injected with insulin at these sites. Kirk did not have diabetes and had never been prescribed insulin. The deputy medical examiner who performed the autopsy ruled that his death had been a homicide. Someone had intentionally injected him with insulin for the purpose of killing him. When Kirk's was first notified that his death was being considered as potentially suspicious, they were also told that 9 or 10 other veterans had been killed under similar suspicious circumstances on that floor of that hospital prior to his death. This would be a major issue described in the claim Kirk's family would later file against the Veterans Administration. If the medical examiner's conclusion is correct, Felix Kirk McDermott was murdered while he was in the care and custody of the Lewis A. Johnson VA Medical Center, despite the VAMC being on notice of the previous wrongful injections, according to the attorney representing Kirk's daughter. Despite there being evidence that someone was murdering veterans at the hospital had done nothing to stop them, allowing an increasing number of people to be murdered. It would ultimately be determined that potentially as many as 20 murders using unauthorized insulin injections were committed at the hospital over a nearly year-long period between July of 2017 June of 2018. By the time Melanie and her family filed their claim, a person of interest had been identified, but since charges had not been filed against them, their identity was not then publicly released. This person of interest in the suspicious deaths brought on by unexplained hypoglycemic events was identified in the early days of the investigation, which began in June of 2018, nearly a year after the deaths began. In those previous 11 months, various members of the staff had discussed amongst themselves how strange it was that elderly men kept having these episodes in the early morning hours with no medical explanation, but no one reported their concerns, even when the deaths began occurring much more frequently in the early months of 2018. In June of 2018, a doctor only publicly identified as Hospitalist B finally met with the hospital's associate chief of staff after speaking with other physicians about their patients. According to a later report, the associate chief of staff's attitude exemplified the response of most employees, that the events were likely medically based and that there was no need to report. Hospitalist B insisted that something was going on and it was potentially criminal. On June 28th, the Veterans Affairs Office of the Investigator General was contacted. The FBI joined the investigation the next day, and the U.S. Attorney General's office joined a week later. An extensive investigation into deaths that occurred at the hospital was required, but investigators at first looked at 8 cases doctors had initially identified in hopes of quickly identifying a person of interest and preventing them from harming any more patients. They soon realized that only 3 of the hospital's employees had been working at the times just before the suspicious hypoglycemic events occurred. Only one of these employees worked on floor 3A, where all of the suspicious deaths had occurred. Electronic records confirmed that the other 2 employees had been in other areas of the hospital at the times in question. This left one potential person of interest. This individual remained an employee of the hospital for the time being, but was removed from patient care on July 5, 2018. They were terminated from the hospital in March of 2019 based on dishonest answers they had provided during interviews related to the investigation. The person of interest was 46-year-old Rita Mays. She was never taken into custody until July 14, 2020, 2 years after the investigation began. She was finally taken into custody that day after she appeared in federal court to plead guilty to 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of assault with intent to commit murder. The assault charge stemmed from the death of Russell R. Posey, a 92-year-old Navy veteran who served during World War II. While Mays admitted to injecting him with insulin, did not believe that they had sufficient medical evidence to prove that the injection directly caused his death in court. While there were approximately 20 deaths deemed suspicious during the investigation, prosecutors ultimately concluded that they could not prove Mays's involvement to a sufficient legal standard to bring charges in connection to all of them. In addition to George, Archie, and Kirk, Mays also confessed to murdering 4 other veterans by injecting them with insulin while they were in the hospital. 82-year-old Robert Edge Sr. was a veteran of the United States Navy. He would later be described by his family as a kind and gentle man who could build almost anything, which helped him always find work when he returned home after serving during the Korean War. 96-year-old William Holloway served in the United States Army during World War II. He had signed up for the Army before he had even turned 18, which meant he had to obtain permission from his father in order to enlist. Robert Lee Kozel Sr., 89, served in the United States Army from 1951 until 1953. He was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky with the 11th Airborne Division as a field artillery parachutist. He loved music and was an active member of his church. He was skilled at fixing things and passed his skills on to his 2 sons. He was the proud grandfather of 3 grandchildren. According to his family, he loved to dance, to sing, and to play his harmonica. On Christmas Day of 2017, he learned that he was going to be a great-grandfather, and his happiness at the news brought him to tears. He never got to meet his great-grandchild because Rita Mays killed him just over a month later. 88-year-old Raymond Golden served in the United States Army from 1951 until 1953, and in the United States Air Force from 1955 until 1973. He went on to become a mail carrier. He was survived by his wife, 2 children, and 5 grandchildren. In addition to spending time with his friends and family, he enjoyed bowling, fishing, and woodworking. Rita Mays was, like all of her victims, a veteran. She served in the Army National Guard from November 2000 to April 2001, and then again from February 2003 until May of 2004, during which time she was deployed to Iraq and Kuwait, where she worked in a non-combat position repairing chemical equipment. She was discharged from the National Guard in October of 2006 following her final duty assignment with the Guard's 115th Engineer Company in Clarksburg. Mays was hired as a nursing assistant at Johnson Medical Center in 2015 and assigned to work the night shift on floor 3A of the medical surgical unit. A later investigation into the hospital would reveal numerous failings that had allowed Mays to murder so many patients. The first of these errors occurred when Mays was hired. Prior to working at the VA hospital, Mays had been employed for 3 years at a group home for adults with disabilities. During this time, she went from an entry-level position as a caregiver to a residential manager who supervised 15 employees. She left the group home for the job at the hospital under good terms, according to the parent company of the home. However, her job prior to working as a caregiver was at the North Central Regional Jail. She worked as a corrections officer there from August of 2005 until September of 2012. While in this position, inmates accused her of using excessive force. She and several other corrections officers were named in a 2013 lawsuit, which claimed she had kicked and helped restrain an inmate so that another officer could stomp on his head. Mays then allegedly spat in the inmate's face, cursed at him, and threatened him. Mays and her co-defendants all denied that they had used excessive force, and a federal judge dismissed the lawsuit. The Johnson Medical Center was not aware of these allegations because they had failed to perform the complete background and employment checks required for her position in a facility run by a federal agency. Had they learned about the excessive force allegations, she most likely would not have been hired in a patient care position, and the hospital would have had grounds for terminating Mays during her probationary employment period, which ended in September of 2016, months before the first murder. The hospital had another opportunity to learn of these allegations when Mays was nominated. Mays received the award in September of 2017, just months after she committed her first murder. Mays worked as a nursing assistant, which meant that she did not have the training necessary for her to work in a medical position. Her job mainly entailed assisting patients with basic daily tasks like eating and bathing, monitoring vital signs, and sitting with patients who required constant supervision. Mays had been the nursing assistant assigned to sit with several of the murdered men just prior to their initial unexplained hypoglycemic events, a fact which increased authority suspicions that she was the person responsible for the deaths. Mays was interviewed by investigators 3 times. She spent much of her first interview complaining about her job and how she was often asked to work in other areas of the hospital or perform tasks that she felt were below her position. She denied any involvement in the suspicious deaths. However, hospital technology records show that immediately after the first interview, Mays returned to her workstation and began looking for a new job. While investigators felt that Mays was the most likely perpetrator in the case because she was the only person who had the access to commit all of the murders, their case against her was entirely circumstantial. The hospital pharmacy did not use the Veterans Administration mandated system to track its medication inventory, and supply rooms and medication carts were not locked. There were no security cameras covering common areas, including the rooms where medications were stored, so there were no records of Mays taking the insulin or security footage showing her in the areas where it was stored. This means that Mays had the opportunity to take the insulin without being caught, but it meant that there was no evidence that she had. Since investigators did not have any of the actual insulin bottles or syringes used in the murders, they also did not have any fingerprints or other physical evidence tying Mays to the insulin. The investigation, therefore, went on for 2 more years despite the almost immediate identification of Mays as the prime suspect. Circumstantial evidence against her continued to pile up. Examination of her social media accounts found posts complaining about her patients and making jokes about medically restraining them despite the fact that Mays was not authorized to administer medications. In Facebook messages, she complained about having to deliver medications doctors used as they fought to save George Shaw's life. A search of her internet history showed that Mays had researched female serial killers and the number of victims they each had, and that she watched a series on Netflix called Nurses Who Kill. While this activity does not indicate criminal activity, one of the episodes of the show was about a nurse who killed patients using insulin, proving that Mays, who did not have any medical education, would have known that insulin could be used to kill someone. Mays was married, but her husband was incarcerated on child pornography charges during the investigation. She would call him almost every morning after returning home from her night shift, and their phone calls were recorded. The morning after one of the unexplained hypoglycemic events, Mays complained to her husband about the patient she had been assigned to sit with during her shift and how she had wanted to strangle him. In another call, she complained about her arms being sore from doing compressions while trying to help revive one of her victims. She was upset that the previously stable patient's family had not signed a do not resuscitate order. Since there was no order on file, when the patient had experienced an unexplained hypoglycemic event the week before, the hospital staff had used all available measures to save his life. She told her husband that the patient would have just fallen asleep and not woken up when his blood sugar level dropped to 30 if they had just done nothing, a statement that authorities found odd from someone without any formal medical education. Mays spent hours with investigators during her 2 subsequent interviews, but she largely shut down during both of them, with recordings of these interviews consisting largely of silence as investigators waited for responses from Mays, as they offered to help her if she explained what had happened. Mays did acknowledge during the 3rd interview that the evidence was pointing towards her as the person who had killed the patients. After this 3rd interview, Mays went to the courthouse in order to fill out an affidavit requesting a court-appointed attorney. However, She was not eligible for one since at the time, she had not been charged with a crime and investigators had not named her in a target letter. Once they learned that Mays had made this trip to the courthouse, investigators decided that she may be more willing to speak with them once she had legal representation. They issued a target letter stating that they believed she had committed several crimes, which allowed her to be assigned 3 court-appointed attorneys in the following weeks. Mays and her attorneys then began the process of negotiating a deal in which she would plead guilty to the murders and the assault charge that authorities believed they had the evidence to successfully prove in court. The families of the victims were all consulted and they agreed to Mays pleading guilty, rather than going to trial. Mays was sentenced on May 11, 2021. At the sentencing hearing, her lawyers asked the judge to sentence her to 30 years in prison, a sentence at the lower end of sentencing guidelines for the crimes she had pleaded guilty to. In justifying this request, they pointed to May's difficult childhood and her post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis, which stemmed from a sexual assault she suffered while in the military. May herself addressed the court, saying, "I don't ask anyone for forgiveness because I don't think I could forgive anyone for doing what I did. I can only say that I'm sorry for the pain I caused the families and my family." Numerous family members of May's victims watched the sentencing hearing, either in person or over video conference. Many of them spoke about their loved ones and the impact their loss had on their families prior to the judge announcing the sentence. "Growing up, he was my hero," Robert Edge Jr. said of his father, Robert Edge Sr. "He took care of me when I was little, and when it was time for me to take care of him, you took that away from me." Addressing Mays, Melanie Proctor, daughter of Kirk McDermott, said, "You took some of the greatest men of our time and preyed on them when they were at their weakest, and for that, you are a coward." U.S. District Judge Thomas Klee was not moved by May's lawyer's request for leniency. He regularly saw individuals in his courtroom who had difficult childhoods in rural West Virginia, as well as veterans who all too commonly suffer from PTSD. He told Mays, "But you're not special. None of these folks are killers, let alone serial killers." Judge Klee went on to say to Mays several times, "Your counsel made the point that you shouldn't be considered a monster. Respectfully, I disagree with that. You are the worst kind. You're the monster that no one sees coming." He sentenced Mays to 7 life sentences, 1 for each murder, plus 20 years for the assault charge. The judge did recommend that Mays serve her sentence at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, as requested by her lawyers, because the facility offers specialized mental health treatment for inmates. However, Mays was ultimately sent to Federal Correctional Institution Aliceville, a low-security facility in Alabama, to serve her sentence instead. While Mays' victims received justice, the loved ones they left behind were still without answers. Mays did not speak of her motive for the murders in court during her initial plea or at her sentencing. Mays did speak with investigators following her guilty pleas being formally entered, and she claimed that 2 different motives led her to commit the murders, although the first reason she provided was clearly a lie meant to make her look better. Mays claimed that she believed she was being merciful by ending her victims' lives and allowing them to pass gently. However, none of her victims had been in danger of dying before she injected them with insulin. They were all expected to survive whatever had brought them to the hospital. Most of their conditions had improved while they were being cared for in the hospital, and some of them were very close to being discharged. Mays injecting these men with insulin did not save them from a painful death. It instead inflicted one upon them. The effects the injections had on the veterans were horrifying. The hypoglycemic events Mays caused resulted in her victims spending hours or days suffering from their side effects. Records show that her victims experienced agitation, loss of motor control, cold sweats, difficulty breathing, and a variety of other severe symptoms as a result of her injecting them with insulin. Furthermore, Mays injected some of her victims on multiple different occasions when the medical intervention meant to stabilize their blood sugar was working and their health was once again improving. The other reason Mays provided for her crimes was the sense of control it gave her when she was experiencing chaos in her personal life and at her job. Unlike her claims of trying to be merciful, this motive at least appears to have some basis in reality. Mays's husband was incarcerated on child pornography charges at the time of her crimes, and she had voiced displeasure at the menial tasks she was expected to perform as a nursing assistant. She had also previously complained about having to work with patients suffering from dementia, a condition which some of her victims have been diagnosed with. While Rita Mays was prevented from causing further harm to patients, the question of how she had been able to kill so many people over an extended period of time without detection remained. According to Veterans Affairs Inspector General Michael J. Missel, while responsibility for these heinous criminal acts lies with Rita Mays, an extensive healthcare inspection by our office found the facility had serious and pervasive clinical and administrative failures that contributed to them going undetected. On the day Mays was sentenced, the Department of Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General released a 100-page report detailing the various failures at the Johnson Medical Center that Mays had been able to exploit. Medication storage and inventory management was a major concern. Improper storage and inventory reporting had allowed Mays to obtain insulin unchecked when she had no reason to have access to any medication as part of her duties, because she did not have the licenses that would allow her to administer it. These failures further prevented the hospital from noticing the excessive amounts of drugs used to counteract insulin being used at the hospital and investigating the unusual need for the drug. Each individual case of unexplained hypoglycemia should have merited concern even without a pattern being identified. Dr. Diane Krieger, who later consulted with investigators, stated that in her more than 30 years of practice, she had never seen blood sugar levels as low as she saw in the records of the cases of unexplained hypoglycemia she examined as part of her work on the case. According to her, even diabetics rarely have their blood sugar drop below 30, and some of Mays's victims had readings as low as 5 after she injected them with high doses of insulin. Testing was not performed to determine the cause of the unexplained hypoglycemic events experienced by 7 of Mays' confirmed victims, and when George Shaw's family insisted on further testing, doctors ordered the wrong test. Other failures involved hospital staff, training, and technology. The employee responsible for patient safety did not train staff about what sorts of incidents needed to be reported. The hospital computer system did not always enter overnight blood sugar readings into patient charts for their doctors to review the following morning. The report identified missed opportunities at every level of leadership at the hospital that could have ended Rita Mays's crime spree. The report made 14 recommendations to improve patient safety at Johnson Medical Center. The Veterans Administration claimed that all of the recommendations would be implemented by March of 2022. By the time of Mays' sentencing in May of 2021, the Veterans Administration had reached tentative financial settlements with the families of her victims. The payouts have so far totaled more than $5 million. The money has not eased the pain the families feel over the loss of their loved ones or at the failings of the hospital they entrusted their loved ones to. According to Kirk McDermott's daughter, Melanie Proctor, "I'm always going to feel guilty about this. I thought I had my dad someplace safe." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.